Teisha Bader, and in the news, Russia's attempt to close the offices of the Jewish Agency in Russia. The agency, of course, helps Jews immigrate to Israel. Russia filed an appeal to that effect, and Israel has sent a delegation to Moscow to meet with Russian officials to try and prevent the shutdown. Well, to help us better understand why this is happening now and what it could mean for Russia-Israel relations and for the Russian Jewish community is Izabella Tabarovsky, Senior Program Associate at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the premier U.S. Center for Advanced Research on Russia and Eurasia, part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Izabella oversees the historical memory, research, and programming, manages its Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs, and coordinates its U.S.-Israel Working Group on Russia in the Middle East. She joins us now from Israel. Izabella, thank you so much for being here on JBS.
It's good to be here.
Thank you so very much, Izabella. So why is this happening now, in your opinion?
Look, I think in order to understand it, we first have to understand the broader context in which this is happening. Russia, over the past several months, has accelerated the shutdown of foreign organizations. Everything that's foreign inside of Russia is being expelled. It's been a long-term process. It's been going on since, I would say, 2012, when USAID was expelled. And it's accelerated. The British funds and think tanks have been expelled in recent months. Polish organizations have been shut down. All manner of organizations have been shut down. And so we can see it in this context, in this broader context. Now, of course, there is also a very specific context in each of these cases. With each of these organizations, there is the national context. There is the context of the relations between Russia and Germany or Russia and Poland. And in this case, of course, the context of Russian-Israeli relationship is really important. This relationship has become a lot more complex since the beginning of the war.
I can imagine. And you are speaking to us from Israel now.
Right.
And Israel is in a complicated situation, a sensitive situation when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, with Israel providing aid to Ukraine, humanitarian aid, medical aid, and then more recently providing defensive aid to Ukraine, flak jackets and helmets. So that's been going on, though, for several months. Do you think the fact that Yair Lapid is now prime minister, or what has shifted that this move has come specifically now? And do you agree that this seems to be a direct response, of course, to Israel's position on Ukraine? How is the timing of this? Is it significant, the timing of this appeal that Russia made in Moscow?
Look, I think that this is a signal that Putin is sending at a time when the situation actually has entered a very critical phase for him. It's clear now that the blitzkrieg did not work. The sanctions, the West has not collapsed. The sanctions continue. The West seems to be united still. And some of the sanctions, their effects in fact, will be felt more strongly come the fall, because some of the crucial supplies will have run out. Some of the kind of import substitution programs have not kicked in yet that Russia has planned. And so it's a really crucial moment. And Putin is looking for every opportunity to increase his chances to put pressure on the West and the West's allies. And of course, Israel is a crucial ally of the United States, and it has chosen to take the side of the West in this conflict. And this is an opportunity to remind Israel that, look, I mean, we just saw Putin go to Iran immediately after Biden visited Israel. That's a signal, right? That, look, we're friends with one of your biggest enemies, and we can put pressure on you this way. And we know, and Russia does know, it's known this was part of the Cold War game for 25 years. We know how crucial the issue of Jewish immigration is for you. And so this is another pressure point. So I see it as a way for Putin to create this kind of pressure points on various countries that it thinks, and in Israel in particular, it considers Israel to be a particularly important country that is able to perhaps communicate messages to the United States, perhaps even exert pressure on the United States. I believe that this is his assessment. And I think that there is another side to the timing. Israel is entering an election campaign. And this is one of the ways in which Russia traditionally attempts to manipulate or complicate, create confusion in internal election campaigns in different countries, to throw in something that will increase division, that will increase incitement, that will help one side against the other. And we already have seen Netanyahu grab onto this and claim that, look, when I was the prime minister, we had a great relationship with Russia. And this is Yair Lapid who is doing this, and it's his fault. And so elect me and I will solve this issue. And I think this is a very problematic statement for all kinds of reasons. I think that Jewish immigration needs to be a consensus issue. He is essentially politicizing it, and it's very dangerous. But this is what's happening. And I think that it very well can be maybe part of the plan.
So I do want to mention that we're taping this on July the 27th, and news just was released today that Israel got the go-ahead to send a legal delegation to meet with Russian officials in Moscow. This will include representatives from the foreign ministry, from the prime minister's office. It's a significant move that, and apparently the officials from Israel have been waiting since Sunday for visas. Russia didn't approve the visas, just giving them a bit of a hard time, it seems, before saying, okay, you can come. Do you think this is something that can be smoothed over fairly easily in a diplomatic manner, with some meetings sort of kept on the down low? Or do you think this has the potential to escalate into something more serious?
Well, look, it's really hard to predict. I think it can go either way, but I believe that without Israel giving Putin something that he really, really needs, I think it will be hard to resolve it. I don't believe that this is simply an issue of the claims that have been made, that this is the Jewish agency in Russia somehow breaking Russian privacy laws and collecting information on Russian citizens that it shouldn't be collecting. I think that these are just overtly stated reasons. But I think, as I said, I think there is much, much more than that. And Israeli officials have signaled and said openly, in fact, in the last 48 hours, that they would prefer for this to be resolved quietly. So some negotiations may happen behind the scenes. I don't think that it will be the lawyers who are going to Moscow who will be doing this negotiation. We know that President Herzog has been brought into the picture. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I will not make any predictions at this point.
Understood. Now let's talk for a minute about the immigration situation. Obviously, there has been a very large influx of Jewish immigrants and non-Jewish immigrants as well from Ukraine to Israel. And Russia has also seen a very large increase, seemingly connected, of course, to Russia's assault on Ukraine. I think the numbers are more than twice what they were last year as far as Jewish immigrants from Russia to Israel. So is that also, I mean, it's all connected, right? But is Russia also somehow upset or angry at those numbers that so many of the Jewish community are leaving? Or is it just a way to, as you suggested earlier, sort of send a signal and make a point?
To be honest with you, I would be surprised if this is the motivating factor here, because right now, if you look again at the bigger picture, Russia has come back to a lot of the kind of ways in which it behaved in the late Soviet period in the 70s and 80s. But the issue of immigration is not one of them, right? Back then, you couldn't emigrate from the Soviet Union freely. The Jewish immigration really was a big part of the struggle during the Cold War, and other people couldn't emigrate unless they really fought for it. Today, people can leave Russia freely for now. And in fact, since the war started, we don't know the exact numbers, but probably some 300,000 people have left. And I think that Putin's regime prefers it that way. They want for everybody who thinks differently to leave the country, so that only those who really want to stay inside, stay inside. So I don't believe that the Jewish immigration is a motivating factor here. I think it's other issues that are bringing this on.
I'd like to read you some of a Facebook post that Natan Sharansky wrote just about 5 days ago. Of course, Sharansky was chair of the Jewish Agency for many years. He is really the face of the struggle of Soviet Jewry, being a former refusenik. He wrote quite at length on Facebook, "Since the beginning of Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, Israel has taken a cautious stance and offered only limited support to Ukraine due to two key strategic aspects: protecting Israel's interests in the fight against Iranian bases in Syria and maintaining Israel's ability to support and assist Jews in Russia." He notes that Russia isolated itself from the free world, strengthened its military and political alliance with Iran and Syria, and at the same time took steps to stop the operations of the Jewish Agency. And Sharansky says these steps are a reminder. We must protect our interests in ways that don't rely on relinquishing our moral positions, but rather on insisting to uphold them and to join the free world's fight to stop Russia's aggression. Izabella, what is Sharansky saying here? Is he suggesting that Israel should do more for Ukraine, worry less about what Russia has to say or what Russia might do?
Well, far be it from me to really interpret Natan Sharansky. I can only offer my own view on this. And I think I think that as far as I understand what he's saying, I think it's close to it. I think that it's important that Israel stand with the West because it is a values issue. And Russia is now so far outside kind of the pale in terms of becoming dictatorial and authoritarian and oppressive. And really, it's a police state once again. So I think that in terms of values, absolutely, Israel must stand with the West and for Ukraine. There is no question about it. In terms of what else Israel can do for Ukraine, I don't quite see what else it can do, to be honest with you. I think that it has taken 20,000 Ukrainian refugees, as you mentioned before. It has offered humanitarian aid, defensive kind of goods, right, to help Ukraine defend itself. It set up a field hospital. So I'm not quite sure what other tools there are in Israel's arsenal in order to help Ukraine. There aren't any sanctions that it can impose on its own that would make any difference to Russia. It has expressed its position clearly, including at the UN. So from my perspective, I think it's doing quite a lot already.
Can you talk for a moment about your own experience leaving Russia? I don't know how old you were at the time when that happened, but how that sort of has informed how you see the situation and what your thoughts are on what might be the next steps in this scenario.
So we left when it was still the Soviet Union in 1989, and it was hard to leave. We always wanted to leave. We wanted to leave for many, many, many years. And for many years, the exit was completely closed, and then it opened and we were able to leave. And at the time when we left, it was still impossible to go back. It was still that time when you left, you were considered a traitor of your own country. They took away your citizenship. And I remember getting on the plane to Austria, because at the time you had to fly through Austria. You couldn't fly directly to either Israel or the United States. And we emigrated to the United States. I remember getting on that plane and thinking, okay, well, now the bridges are burned. I can only now look forward. I can't look back anymore. So that in a way informs my perspective in that I have the historical background. I've also been a scholar of Soviet Jewish, of Soviet Jewry, and in particular, the movement, the fight for emigration and the fight for Soviet Jewry. And so all of these parallels are not too far from my mind when I watch the current situation. When I hear Foreign Minister Lavrov say the things that he said recently about Jews being some of the worst anti-Semites. I mean, all of this rings bells for me, perhaps much more than for others, because I know that this is the culture from which he came up and from which also Putin came up, right? Because the KGB really fought the Jewish immigration for many, many, many years. And they kind of had these views that Lavrov expresses. So it helps me understand the context a little bit better.
And are you in touch with family, friends in Russia? And what do you hear from the Russian Jewish community with this situation now with the Jewish Agency? Is there any sense of concern or panic, or is it believed to just be something that will get smoothed over? What are you hearing?
Look, since this issue with the Jewish Agency started, I haven't talked to anyone in Russia about it, because I have to tell you, we've all been extremely careful since February 24th, since the war started, because we're all aware of how dangerous it is for Russians to say anything that might disagree with the government line. And so when I talk to my relatives in Russia, I don't ask them any difficult questions. I don't want to put them in difficult situations. But I do think that for many Russians, if the Jewish Agency is closed, for many Russian Jews, it will be a loss, because Jewish Agency has been about immigration, but it has also been about promoting and supporting Jewish culture and the learning of Hebrew, and that kind of a connection that even for the Jews who may not want to emigrate is still important. Now, I think that the officials here in Israel have said that even if the agency is closed, they will find a way to get the Jews out who do want to get out. They were able to do it when, again, in the darkest times of the Cold War. But what this does is that essentially it turns Jews into political football, which, again, they were for 25 years in the Cold War. And we may come back to that. And again, this is a pressure tactic.
Absolutely. And that is actually something that Natan Sharansky also wrote about in his Facebook post. He said something like, it would behoove us to remember that Israel was able to, deal with immigration, Jewish immigration from Russia, even when things were closed. Obviously, it was with great challenges, but I'm glad you brought that up as well. Avi Meir, who worked for the Jewish Agency for several years, tweeted, "An attack on the Jewish Agency in Russia is an attack on Jewish life there," which is a very strong statement. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, for sure. For sure. And especially in the current moment when the situation is so flammable in Russia. The public airwaves are filled with nationalistic, xenophobic talk, with incitement. There has been violence already. There is a culture of violence against those who disagree with the government, against protesters. And we know that in a situation like that, a minority, an ethnic religious minority, and especially Jewish minority, is always potentially in danger. So I do worry about that a lot.
And just getting back to immigration for a moment, what are your thoughts on how this is a very large influx of refugees, of immigrants into a very small country? How are you seeing that so far? Do you think Israel is managing that situation fairly well? It has to be challenging.
I think it's doing really well. I think for Israel, these are big numbers compared to, say, a year ago. But don't forget that in the early 90s, Israel absorbed 1 million Soviet Jewish refugees within just a few short years. Israel is very well situated to deal with these kinds of challenges, with absorbing people. And I just saw results of a recent survey, which says that most people who have come in the last 6 months, since the beginning of the war, are feeling comfortable. Obviously, there are challenges. They're looking for jobs. They're learning Hebrew, but they're planning to stay. These are not accidental refugees. These are people who are planning to stay.
And Sharansky, again, just mentioning him for the last time in his post, makes sure to encourage those who are planning to immigrate or who were thinking of immigrating to Israel not to let this situation stop them from doing so. He was being very encouraging and very supportive of the Russian Jewish community and certainly of those who are trying to come to Israel who have plans to do so.
Absolutely. I would agree with that urging.
And before I let you go, Izabella, how would you like to see this resolved? And do you think if it is resolved, will there just be a next thing that Russia tries to pressure Israel with, or will we have some sort of calm for a while?
I think that Russia has a number of things to pressure Israel on. We didn't talk about this church property in the old city of Jerusalem that Russia really wants to get back. There's obviously Syria. There's Iran. There are all kinds of pressure points that all kinds of levers that Russia has in its hands. So I don't anticipate the pressure going away anytime soon.
Okay, well, we will have to wait and see, and perhaps we can have you back on when we have more news on the situation with Russia, the Jewish agency, Israel now being flying, the delegation reportedly flying to Moscow tonight and meeting with Russian officials there to see if this can be solved diplomatically. And the Jewish agency and many others, as you mentioned, everyone's trying to sort of keep this quiet, on sort of that level of this can be resolved through dialogue, through talks. It doesn't have to escalate into anything more. It's a legal proceeding. So there's going to be a lot of wait and see, it seems.
Absolutely.
Izabella Tabarovsky, thank you so much for joining us here on JBS.
Thank you so much for having me.
We appreciate it tremendously. And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Golub, our technical manager, Michael Paley, transmissions manager, John McDevitt, and to our producer, Carol Lilienthal. And thank you for watching In the News.